Hello and welcome back to Nelson All Over Cards. Today, Villain Theory is back on to continue on our deck building series, which I completely blanked on how many we've done. This is 7?
It could be 7. It's a great guess. Great number. Very lucky
I'm
number.
sure we will hit 7 or have hit 7 in the near or future past. So, today we are talking about card cost efficiency, or basically what you should be expected to pay for a specific benefit in different situations. Did I explain that well enough, Villain?
I think so. One way I think of it is sort of like cost to output in like the ratios, that kind of. But yeah. What do you want to get from what you pay, and how does that all shake out?
Yeah, because there's a lot of numbers in this game. There's a lot of ways that you can look at this game, and it's not always one answer. So, if you are watching this video expecting to have the secret formula to exactly what you need to build the perfect deck and play the perfect game of Marvel Champions, that's going to be a longer video than what we can make because every single situation can be different and changes what you need to pay and or play in order to progress the game state in the direction that you need it to be moved. But that's kind of the preamble. Before we get started, Villain, can you tell everyone where they can find you and who you are?
Yes, I'm VillainTheory. I make decks. You can find those on Marvel CDB. Same username. You guys know the drill. Sometimes post stuff on Reddit, but yeah, that's me.
Excellent. And all of your links will be down below in the description. And I will say that we are getting better and smarter because we have already preemptively decided to cut this one into 2 videos, whereas a lot of our previous ones have been cut into 2 videos after the fact. So, this first video, what are we talking about?
So what I think we're talking about first is sort of general principles, because as you were saying, which I think this is such a key point, there isn't, you can, there are a lot of different situations, things change. There's no sort of magic code of values that are always, in play, because depending on the situation, how you value things is going to change. So static values, they're useful, but they have limited use. Um, Following that, I think we're just going to go right into damage and threat removal, probably, two of the biggest parts of the game.
Nice, nice. Yeah, and I'm excited because we were talking right before we hit record, which yes, I did hit record. It's always a little bit of a panic right there. Right before we hit record, that this is not something that I think I do very well in my gameplay. I don't think I have a good understanding of exactly how much of X needs to be paid for Y output. I think I'm more of a in the game type player, and so I'm really looking forward to this discussion for someone who does a lot of this and values cards very mathematically and can, compare cards and situations on what needs to be made in the deck and what needs to be played. And so this building video, I will also say very quickly that this also has a lot of gameplay implications outside of just the deck building implications. So it's still part of the deck building series, but we are bleeding a little bit into gameplay at this point. That being said,
Yeah.
what are the general principles of the cost versus efficiency for Marvel Champions cards?
Yes. I wonder which one to start with. I probably should have planned this out. They're all kind of relevant. So, what I will say about the general things, let's say I pay X money, X resources, I get X damage or Y damage. I think a flat value is a good baseline. Whenever I see a new card revealed or something, I've got these numbers going through my head, but that number in actual gameplay will be changing, and decks are built for gameplay. So when you're building a deck, all very relevant. I think one of the most important principles I would say is supply versus demand. So there are different ways you can look at this. You could be in the case where you're in the middle of a game, the villain pulled advance, they're like one threat away from destroying you, and you're like, well, my whole hand is damage. I've got a massive demand for threat removal. Where's my supply? So now you could have a card that's maybe, it might cost your whole entire hand and only remove one threat, but that is definitely the play you want to make. So the complete value has shifted because you need this threat removal. And you can sort of step back and take that to a deck building level, even just a like level of the card pool. If I have to say aggression, threat removal isn't low supply in aggression. I would say it has options, but it doesn't have as many options. I would say as the other aspects. If you have the entire card pool, I would say that's a bit more limited. And I think the other side of the coin is you can bring too much of something. So to stay with the threat removal topic, um, if you're playing Justice in solo, especially, you load up with all threat removal. You might have like 4 different ways to remove threat in your hand, and oh, there's one threat on the main scheme. It's like, huh, well, I guess that one threat's going, but it's like, um, so there's kind of a sweet spot, of what you're looking for, and that can differ based on the scenario, hero aspect, combination of multiplayer. So there's no like, oh, this is what you need, or this is how much you want to pay. But I would say in terms of how we're doing, cost to the output, the demand of the situation really does influence what you want to pay for something. Um,
Yeah, that makes a
I-
lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And a lot of those things that you touched on are in previous videos, which I'll link everything down below. But one of the things that caught my ear, and one of the I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper on, is the multiplayer versus solo part of that equation. Because do you find yourself in that video we talked about specializing more in a multiplayer setting. So 3, 4 players. If a Justice player loads their deck up with threat removal, they'll probably be better off. Is is that what you were saying when you were saying that all kind of is factored into the equation of the supply demand curve that we're looking at? Because there
yeah,
is more demand of threat removal, you need more supply of your threat removal cards in multiplayer.
Yeah, that's the basic principle. I mean, we talked about decks at different player counts a bit before as well, and there's more threat in multiplayer, but you also got someone else dealing with it. So, depending on if you've planned your decks beforehand, you might want to prioritize things a lot differently in that regard. But also, something about multiplayer that's specific for supply versus demand is side schemes scale. And if a couple of players get a couple of side schemes, your demand's going to just shoot up. So, I would say the Justice player is going to want, a good amount of it, but everyone else is going to have to be ready that the demand for them to do what they might not want to do is going to change, varyingly.
Yeah. And I guess this is a little bit preemptive of a discussion, but I do think that that is going to start changing now once we get player side schemes, because
Yes.
it's effectively a sink for threat removal that
Yes.
that we're gonna get,
I'm
and so
excited.
it's gonna change the math and change the demand of threat removal.
Yeah,
So
threat
that'll
removal
be
is
fun.
going to be in, I would say, of the main ways you interact with the game, which I would say is like damage and threat removal and kind of defense or healing, but that's kind of almost like damage mitigation. It's kind of the opposite side, threat goes up and down, health goes up and down. Um, I would already say threat is kind of the most in demand. There's a shorter supply of threat removal, compared to damage, which I think is very prevalent. If you want defense, you've got allies can block you, that kind of thing. Player size is going to make threat removal even better. So, it's going to be very interesting how that impacts things.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so that's the supply demand. Any other general principles that we wanted to talk about?
Yeah, so another one that I think is really key is versatility versus efficiency. And I've also got another phrasing for this, which I would say is kind of like option advantage, like almost like flexibility in what you can do, versus just getting like the biggest numbers possible for the lowest cost.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I think we've been into that in previous videos a bit as well, but generally something that allies are a great example. Allies is a very powerful card type. They can attack for all they can block, makes them extremely versatile. I think another example of versatility are just cheap cards. So you can play multiple cards and then you can kind of do what you need to do. If your only way to deal with this big horrendous minion is to spend your entire hand on an attack, but you've got another problem, maybe it's Shadow of the Past, and you've also got this awful side scheme, you're not being versatile there. Um, but on the flip side, maybe that attack is doing humongous damage, it's overkilling, and now you're in a position where you can win. So there are times it's good, uh, and definitely if you're always getting extremely efficient plays, you're generally doing well. But at the same time, you need to have the right thing. So with all of these things, maybe not the supply and first demand. You want as much supply as you can, and no demand for anything. But all these other points, I would say, there's kind of a tug of war. There's good points on both sides, and you're kind of looking for a healthy balance.
Okay. And I really like this comparison, and it brings me back to our first video that we ever did, the cost curve, where we talked about smoothing out the cost curve so that you had the options of, having that high impact card of, the 3 cost card that's going crisis averted that's going to remove 6 threats when you need that situation, but you also want to smooth out so that you have a statistical likelihood of having lower cost cards. So if you don't play crisis averted, you can play, two, I don't know, two smaller attack cards or something to take out your minions, so that you have the versatility, and that is, I think, really important and something that will change the general principles that we're going to be outlining in these couple videos for your specific game. And like Villain has been saying, if you can be super efficient, take out that huge side scheme or whatever, but you're going to lose to damage, or vice versa, you can take out the minion, but you're going to threat out, then efficiency no longer matters at that point.
Yes, yeah.
But efficiency does matter, and so it's finding the balance in that efficiency versus versatility sliding scale that is going to work best for your hero in your game. And so I'm excited because this is something that I find myself, at the end, I was like, oh, I had way too much threat removal in it. Nice. Would our all the videos are running together at this point now, but I
Oh, same.
also we had a video, and I will figure it out and link that as well, where we were talking about the short versus long term advantages, where you have upgrades and supports are your long term advantages, your events are that short term burst efficiency, allies are kind of that bridge, they have medium. How does that play into this conversation?
Oh, I'm really glad you said that, because my next point I was going to bring up was sort of immediate gain versus future gain, or how quickly
Transitions are
things
great.
pay off. Yeah, so this we should have planned this. Let's pretend we planned this. um, but yeah, I mean, in terms of versatility versus efficiency, you can link the two. So generally, the way I would say, about things that pay off quickly, um, they basically, if something's going to pay off slower, like an upgrade or a support, typically, but it can vary. It can be, sometimes allies you keep around forever. Sometimes an event might have a lasting impact, but generally upgrades and supports. If something's going to pay off over time, generally, in terms of sort of resource to what I'm getting out of it, I want more. You can promise me, we get a million. What country are we? Should I use this in? Dollars, pound, some money. You know, you promised me a million resources, in a few turns' time, but I might have lost the game by then, or I might have won the game by then, kind of thing. So if it's slow to pay off, I want a big sort of payoff in the future. It varies depending on how quick that's going to pay off. Something I think is a good example here is to take maybe like an ally like Eros or Daredevil. In protection, Daredevil. Both of those allies have 2 fort, and if you fought twice with them, they're defeated. So you can get 4 threat removal out of them across 2 turns. Or I can play it for Justice for the same cost and remove 4 threat immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a general principle, 4 in the present is often a lot better than 2 now, 2 in the future. But you've then got the versatility and efficiency in supply and demand. If you only need to remove 2 threat, being able to split that 2 threat up is really useful. Or, you've also got the fact that the allies can also block or potentially do a little bit of damage. So you've got the versatility advantage as well. So if something is slower to pay off, it could also have other advantages. So again, nothing is like a one-to-one thing here, which I know is a little bit maybe hard to follow, but is it's just good to keep in mind, I would say.
Yeah, and that's what makes it a game, right? I, I don't remember if we were talking about this before we hit record or not, but if it's something that you can just throw into Excel and spit out the answer, it's not a fun game at that point. And a lot of that fun comes in the decision making process, because yeah, it goes back to the versatility, right? Allies are more versatile than a Fort Justice. Either you can split that threat or you can block with them. arrows can, take a hit from Venom with 17 boost cards, and hopefully one of them doesn't give him overkill, but
I probably will.
it probably will. Um, nice. Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. Um, so I do want to talk about specific examples and put concrete numbers to some of these, but I want to make sure that we get all of our general principles talked about first. I'm going to let you talk about some more of those if you have them.
I've got two more left, and
Perfect.
they're kind of linked.
Okay.
So the first one I've got is sort of conditional cards or effects versus unconditional. So,
Okay.
if you jump through this hoop, you get this extra bonus. And if you don't, maybe the card doesn't work or you get less of an effect kind of thing. So an example is clear the area. If you can remove the last threat, you get to draw a card. If you don't, the card, you don't get anything extra.
Right.
And though this varies, conditional cards tend to be a little bit more powerful, but you have to try and line them up to make them work. And unconditional tend to be a little bit less powerful, but they're more sort of generally applicable. They're easier to set up. It's not always the case. Sometimes you have already unconditional card, you just play it whenever, and it's really good. Those tend to be among the more powerful cards. Um, but yeah, that's generally a healthy balance, I would say. And
And real quick before we move on,
mm,
I want
mm,
to I want to ask a question. I think I know the answer, but I want to ask the question anyways. When you say more powerful card, it is not necessarily more bigger numbers. It's more efficient. Is that what?
yes,
Okay.
it
Because
it
clear the
can
area,
yeah.
1 for 2, or I guess 2 for 2 if we're talking effective resource. That's not a big number. That's not a flashy number, but it is a conditional card with a good benefit. Um,
Yes.
so okay, so it's more efficient. You're getting more bang for your buck.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Um, it's interesting because in some ways, Marvel Champions is a numbers game. Everything has a number. You want their health number to go down. Yours to stay up. You deal numbers of damage to make that happen. But all these situations do make it vary. There's no, like we keep saying. I think this is really important. There is no single answer. But if something is efficient, and what I would say about clear the area, might get onto this a bit more later, but because it's a cheap card, it is quite versatile in what you can then go on to do as well on your turn. It has a lot of advantages in that way.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. Okay, cool. Sorry for cutting you off, but
No, no. The final one I have is sort of guaranteed gains versus potential gains. So there are some cards that you have to sort of play in advance, and you don't know what's going to happen. A lot of these are like the defensive cards. So if I play Expert Defense, gives me +3 defense, but then the villain only gets a 0 boost card. I might not have actually got any damage prevention from Expert Defense. On the other hand, he might have got a free boost card, and actually I got the whole benefit from it. So that's one is quite I would say there's quite a lot of complexity there as well. And sometimes, quite a lot of the time in cards like that, you won't actually get the maximum value, but you'll get enough that it was a good play. But
mm,
it can vary. Sometimes you could get tons of value, and other times you get like next to nothing. Yeah, the next examples I have to my head are a lot of defensive ones, but I think a good comparison is something like Judoka skill, hope I'm saying that correctly, and energy barrier. You both use them to block damage, but Judoka skill, you have to use that in advance. So although it promises 2 less attack on the villain, you have to defend as well. So if the boost card isn't high enough, you might only get 1 or even 0 of that damage reduction. Whereas energy barrier, you're only using it when you are getting damaged.
yeah. And so I'm trying to think of a non defensive event, maybe like a toe to toe that leads into. uh,
I mean, I think toe to toe is a really good example because the villain's attacking you. You don't know how that much they're attacking you for. They could get a boost effect. Boost effect could bring in something terrible. It might say now we're feeling the counter. No, probably not. But it could. It can. Things can chain into things. So toe to toes are great. You don't know. This one's almost like you don't know how much of a negative effect as opposed to a gain, but it's the same principle that it's an uncertainty. There's a bit of a gamble. I think to me, my X-Men is another kind of example.
oh yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
or even Kalu in leadership. You might not find a card you're looking for of the right type, and then you don't get that bonus. You probably do, but it's not as good as saying, you definitely do.
yeah, yeah. And so when you're looking at those types of conditional cards, I assume that either needs to come with a higher benefit or a lower cost. just to kind of figure out where we are on that slider in order for it to
Yes, yeah,
be considered a playable card. I guess I guess would be the caveat.
yeah. And it kind of depends how versatile they are as well. And like going back to the other points, and well, how much supply and demand. Maybe if you really need something, you're happy to take a risk. I
Mm,
think something of a risky card, because although I'm talking a lot in gameplay so far, this does extend to deck building. A card I've been experimenting more again with lately. It's an old card. Is I think it's called You'll Pay for That. It's the aggression card, where when you take damage, you can then play it, and sort of however much damage you took is now threat removed from a scheme.
oh, okay,
That
yeah, yeah,
card. Um, and although you can choose to use it, having seen how much damage is there, if you're building your strategy that into your strategy of threat removal, you know, you don't know if that's going to come up at the right time where you can afford to take an attack, or if you're going to take enough damage to cleanly remove that side scheme, and then you might have,
mm.
some kind of, efficiency problems. I still think it's a good card. There's most cards in the game are good in some situation,
Right.
um, but they definitely at a deck building level, sort of, and also in actual play directly when you play it, it can vary. So some cards it will just uppercut. You're gonna get, I think, I use uppercut. It's 5 damage. That was a bad example. But another card like expert defense, you might not actually prevent 3 damage, even though you'll definitely prevent at least up to 3, but you might not get all of that happen.
Nice, nice, yeah. Okay, let's talk numbers. Let's talk about
Hmm.
both, and I want to frame this both in gameplay and deck building. Um, the discussion around both of those aspects, because I think they can be similar, but they're not the same because of our supply demand. There really isn't necessarily there's a, I don't want to say this. There's an anticipated demand when deck building, but there's a real
Yes.
demand when playing, and so
Yes.
that changes the equation drastically. But let's
Hmm.
talk about. Do you want to talk about damage first? Let's talk about damage.
I might rewind a tiny bit to something
Perfect.
we didn't announce we were going to do. This is live, by the way. No, it's not live. But the one thing that is interesting, I think, to talk about just very quickly is, one resource is pretty obvious. It's one resource. But how does that compare to one card? Because a card is a resource, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, it's another option in your hand. We have covered this in other videos, I think. But I think just setting a baseline of values, one resource, not going to surprise anyone. Yeah, it is one resource, but is one card one resource? I tend to value it a little bit higher. It's hard to put it to an exact number. Is it worth like 1.2 of a resource? Uh, it depends on the situation. If you have a bad hand, if you can get more cards into your hand, that's going to really help you out.
Yeah.
If you've got an upgrade you desperately need, getting that card draw is probably going to just get you closer to it. Really going to help you out. Um, but I just think it's worth bearing in mind as we go through, and maybe we reference different cards. We've already talked about clear the area. Um, Generating a resource, which is worth a tiny bit less than drawing a card in most circumstances.
Yeah, and I think the best comparison to that I have in my mind is Helicarrier versus Avengers Mansion.
Hmm.
Helicarrier discounts a resource for 3 printed cost. Avengers draws your card for 4 printed cost. And now that is throughout the entire game, and I don't think cost scales linearly in like ability to pay either. Higher cost cards are harder to pay for than lower cost cards because you're losing more. The opportunity cost is higher as well. But yeah, that's interesting. Um, but as we were saying in the generators video, card draw is always good. You
Hmm.
you can't have too much card draw.
Unless you're against Mysterio and you can see those nasty encounter cards in your deck. But yeah, no, generally. But yeah, we can jump onto damage.
Let's do it. Alrighty,
I,
so I want the most damage no matter what, right?
I mean, if you can get more damage, that's good. Damage is always good as well, unless you're in like, no, you can only win by threat removal. But again,
Yeah.
they're rare. Damage is good. Um,
Also, my turn to rewind. Sorry. Before
okay,
we
yeah,
start
yeah, yeah.
talking about this, is there a difference when you're evaluating costly cards and deck building in hero specific cards versus aspect versus basic cards?
I would generally say no. I mean, the way it works is hero cards are typically the most value, most bang for your buck, then aspect, then basic. Although there are exceptions. Um, but when I'm looking at it, I am still weighing them kind of the same way I'm putting cards in. If I'm never going to play this card over a hero card, ever, does it even need to be in the deck? You get a hand with no hero cards, of course, and that's something you can sort of plan around. But I would say Miles Morales is an example of a hero whose hero cards are extremely high value. So you're kind of building almost a lot of the time supporting those cards for when you don't have them or to help find them. Whereas other heroes have weaker ones where you're like, okay, this aspect card is going to be more of a main thing I'm really relying on. But at the end of the day, if it's a signature card and an aspect card, if I'm paying the same and getting the same damage, I'll value them the same. If I'm getting better from the signature card, I will still value that higher.
Okay,
Uh, yeah.
cool. Okay, awesome. Let's talk about damage
Well, it's my turn to rewind again.
now.
No, no. The only thing I was going to say was what a lot of the time when I'm talking about the cost of something, if I play something that costs 2 resources, but I draw a card back, the net total kind of even, you can almost consider it almost like kind of a rebate. You're getting some of the money you paid back afterwards. So, although I think it's more advantageous to have a card that is purely cheap to begin with, if something is drawing you a card or somehow generating you a resource after you play it, it's kind of a small refund, and you can kind of mostly take that off the original cost when you're figuring things out.
See, that's interesting. I want to talk about this because
Yeah.
I almost think about it the opposite in a lot of situations. Whereas I think a rebate on a card is better because you get to see more cards. And you can use something if you have a four justice and there's only two threat out there, you can use the four justice to play clear the area and then you can draw into something that may be playable.
Hmm. I think that's a very valid point as well. I think it's situational. I would say it depends on the situation. I would agree. I would say card draw probably it's more valuable than being cheaper, but resource generation uh not so much. But it depends what it is. So with Helicarrier and Avengers Mansion, those are very expensive cards. So your versatility that turn, your kind of potential options that turn, if you're playing those big cards, you don't have many options at the end of it. There are a lot of situations, and this is what I was thinking of when I said my original statement, where you will play a big support card like that, and you actually have nothing left in your hand to use it to then generate a resource for and get that refund.
Mm,
Um, so
got it.
there's
Got it.
definitely, yeah. So
Okay.
I would agree with you, but I also agree with me still.
Fair,
So
fair, fair, fair. Yeah. And I think that's
everything
actually
varies.
something that I've learned more from after our discussion when we were talking about Tony Stark's futurist ability, where you get to look at three cards and just the number of cards that you see in a turn is very valuable. Whether or not you get to keep
Mhm.
those, but if you have a choice on what cards you can keep, because you are just looking for the situational cards, you can toss the crisis averted when there's only one threat out there to be taken care of, and you can curate your hand to exactly what you need. And that's just something that you brought up a couple videos ago, and it just kind of like blew my mind. Like my gameplay has changed. Cool.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the main reasons Captain Marvel is very powerful.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, yeah, yep. No, also a very good point, kind of linked in here. Yeah,
Cool.
but
Okay.
I'm damage.
Damage. Let's do it.
Damage. You want to talk about? I'm going to throw out some crunchy numbers. These are what I consider like the real baseline values that I'm like hoping for and how I weigh things. Situations, other effects, these will change it. But if I'm spending 1 resource on damage, I want to get 2 damage for it. So 1 resource, I want to get 2 damage.
And is that
That's like
effective resource or is that printed resource cost?
effective. So I don't know if we've defined it in this video, but we have in the old ones. So every card has a cost, but you also lose the card itself from your hand. So something that's 1 cost, you play it with a card from your hand, you're actually 2 cards down. So the effective cost is kind of including that. So yeah, so one effective resource, I want to get 2 damage. I won't always get 2 damage. Sometimes I'll get even more. But that is like I'm really hoping for that. If I can see an option that gives me that, I'm like, this is a good, valuable option. I could happily take this, and I'd be already pleased whenever I play this. That's what I consider good value. That's like the baseline. You will find that more in signature cards than aspect cards, but there are plenty of aspect cards that also give that value. So that's what I'd consider good, and that's what I'm hoping for. If I can get 1.5 damage, for one resource. Another way of looking at that is 3 damage for 2 if you don't want, your decimals and fractions. 1.5 for one effective resource is what I consider pretty okay value. And this is where versatility comes in. If I play a very cheap card and I only get 1.5 damage instead of 2 for my money, I'm still quite happy because it's versatile. The bigger the instance of damage, the more likely you are to waste something, or not be able to respond to other things. So 1.5 for one resource, I consider, pretty good. Not what I'm aiming for, but still very happy with it a lot of the time. And then we get down to 1 damage for one resource, also known as Haymaker. Uh, uh, it's playable if that's what you need, but it's never what you're aiming for. If I'm putting this into the deck thinking, oh, I can get 1 damage per resource I spend, that's not good. That's the wrong attitude.
Right. Right.
If you've only got the core set, I think Haymaker's actually a good card. But as you have more cards, it's definitely not.
It gets overshadowed very, very quickly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that scales linearly at that point then, right? So if you are looking for 2 damage per resource spent, if we look at a 3-cost card, which would be 4 effective costs, you would be looking for 8 damage, which would be your swinging web kick.
Yes,
makes sense.
Precisely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I am a little surprised that they don't. It's not. I'm a little surprised that it's a linear scale, right? I would think that the opportunity cost would increase the expected damage output of a card.
I would say you're right, but I think we'd then have to move into real decimal resources if I'm giving exact examples. So, I would say, the smaller the, how do I say it? It's really just like, smaller packets, I think, more flexible, more versatile, are worth more.
Yeah.
But if the basic values, 2 for 1 is good, 1.5 for 1, pretty okay. 1 for 1, not good. If you can get 3 for 1 resource, also known as a little card called Turn the Tide, 0-cost card, really good. You get 3 damage. That is extremely good because not only is 0 my favorite cost that a card can have, because it's the most versatile, it's the most flexible. You're also getting, way above the average. Most signature cards, let's take Swinging Web Kick. You will not get 3 damage for every 1 resource you put into that card. You just don't. And that goes for almost every card in the game. So any card that's hitting more than 2 damage for my 1 resource, I consider extremely good.
Cool. So Turn the Tide, 0 for 3, but you do have to have either defeated a side scheme or remove the last threat from a scheme. I don't always remember. Last threat? Okay. So how do you kind of, and this may actually be the second video that we're going to do, but how do you put numbers around that, right? 0 for 3, or I guess 1 for 3 is really, really good, but
it's conditional.
Condition. So how do you think about that when you're deck building and also when you're in gameplay?
This is a really good question. This is really the kind of some of the gritty part of really trying to get the efficiency out of some really like try hard decks. I would say honestly, for the most part, I think we talked a little bit about multiplayer cards and solo cards before, but for the most part, Turn the Tide is more of a solo or 2-player card. You can use it elsewhere, but the less threat is going on, the easier it is to remove the last threat, the easier the condition is to meet. Now, in a solo Justice deck, it's not extraordinarily easy to remove that condition, almost to the point where I actually don't consider Turn the Tide conditional. It definitely is, but a lot of the time, I can kind of expect when I draw Turn the Tide, I'm probably able to play it, and in a lot of cases that is true. But you take that into 2-player, a little bit less certain. You take it into 3-player, a lot less certain. And it's hard to put an exact cost on there. But this is really where kind of the conditional versus unconditional. You want more bang for your buck when it's conditional. So Turn the Tide, 3 damage, 1 effective resource. I consider that exceptional value. So I think that's worth quite a lot of the risk. I don't have an exact figure to say, because it's conditional, it's actually not quite. But the easier the condition is to meet, and this will vary with scenario, player count, what other cards you put into your deck. So there's kind of a moving target. But But when you're putting in conditions like that, you want to make sure you have threat removal. I could put in like how does that count? I could put in like 22 basic cards and then 3 copies of Turn the Tide. I might not have the threat removal I actually wanted to consistently now trigger that. But in an average Justice deck, you're going to have the threat removal. Um, so I would say if you're setting up hoops to jump through, conditions to meet, make sure you've got the ways to get through them, and the more ways you bring, the less of a negative, less of a negative modifier to the actual value of it there is. Uh, I think I said that badly, but hopefully it made sense.
It made sense to me, and basically what I took away from it is that if you the conditional modifiers of the cards that you're deck building for, your deck needs to facilitate the environment where that can be played.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
in a solo, and that could be player count dependent, that could be aspect dependent, that could be hero dependent. That is just part of the equation that we can talk and do a 27-hour long video to try and do them to figure them all out. But that's just going to be something that's going to come with experience. And I guess then on the other side, a card that we mentioned, or I guess not even on the other side, just another kind of angle and question that I have for you is a card that we mentioned earlier is Toe to Toe, which is a 1/2 effective cost for 5 damage with a condition that the villain attacks you.
Mhm.
And so I want to get your thoughts on around this, but the reason that I thought about that is the condition could also be scenario dependent, right? If you have a Juggernaut, one of the new villains coming out, you don't want him to be
Yep.
attacking you. So Turn the Tide does not work there. However, with like a Collector 1 or a lot of these villains that have maybe 1 attack, 2 attack, that gets a lot better. But what are your thoughts
Yes.
around cards like that where the uncertainty also factors into the conditional requirement?
Yeah, I think so. We're talking on like a deck building level overall for the video.
Yeah.
I think you have to ask yourself, what are you building the deck for? Are you building this deck to take against sort of a random villain or a selection of villains, or are you building your deck specifically to counter a specific villain? Because that will change if you include it. I think a villain it's kind of good against is actually Red Skull because you defeat his side scheme, he loses the attack modifier. I think on standard he has a like base attack of 0, so
Yeah.
toe to
Yeah.
toe on a 0 attack villain, kind of nice. Um, it's better than normal. And you've got other heroes. So I can talk about toe to toe in vacuum, but if I'm Spider-Man and I'm getting attacked, I'm drawing a card. Um, so there's a lot of moving targets again. But yeah, it definitely has a massive factor. Like I would never play toe to toe against Thanos. Maybe on his minions.
Yeah.
But I
Okay.
would never use it on Thanos because he's gonna do awful things with the Infinity Stones, and I don't want to suffer.
Right.
He
Right.
hits like a truck as well, of course, like Juggernaut will. Um, so yeah, really, that's a huge factor. You know, you can the normal value I see people put to an encounter card, and I generally agree with kind of an average. Is 3 resources are what it takes to deal with it.
Okay.
But that varies hugely. Like sometimes it won't even take 1. Sometimes it might take like I don't know 7. Side scheme in 4 player would be an example where you have to put in so much effort. Shadow of the Past, Under Fire if you're an expert, and there's a bunch of other nasty ones that are just a massive pain. I don't know if you've ever tried to pay off Spiral Swords or anything, but that's a nightmare. While she's constantly attacking you with these huge values. So encounter card doesn't have a set value. Um, so game knowledge is a big factor there. If you know roughly how nasty the encounter cards are, the cards that make you draw an encounter card, that is more Star Lord and a Star Lord ally. But for an attack, you can also value the attacks differently. An attack from Red Skull is very different to an attack from Thanos. An attack from Mojo is very different to an attack from Juggernaut. Um, so yeah, it really is it's situational. I would say the most way I see people use toe to toe is as minion clearance primarily,
Mm.
uh, in a general sense.
Yeah, and it makes a lot more sense to clear minions. It's just not something that I find myself ever doing. I probably should be though. Okay, so we've got 1 resource for 2 damage. I guess this also goes into your favorite card of all time and my least favorite card of all time, Plan B. Uh, and I guess like technically, to my point, Plan B is under the cost at that point because it does have the conditional requirement of a random card. Now you can set it up to be the
Yes.
last card, but does that just come with the fact that it's a gray card and it can go in any deck, and so the efficiency is lowered slightly because of the versatility of where it can go in a deck, or how does that factor in?
I don't think its straight up efficiency is actually any lower. I think you could compare it to Yarnborn in a way that you pick up this one cost and you're getting 2 damage when you then actually spend into it. But it is once per, you know, basically round, whereas Yarnborn is unlimited.
Yeah.
And it's also a random card discarded. I think those are more of the cons. I actually think if you were to compare it to, say, a signature card, Element Guns, and Star Lord, it's actually pretty good value for what you're getting
Mm-hmm.
damage wise for cost. Um, I think where it shines, I'm gonna stick up for Plan B. Uh, one, cost is quite low, versatility quite low. Cost, you're not giving up a huge amount to get it in play, but it's also supply and demand. If damage is now in demand, you always have that option to meet it.
True.
Um, so it's it's got some things going for it, but you're definitely right that on a strictly damage to cost base, because you have to pay for it initially, it's under what you'd expect. And I would go on to say, because I don't know if we've discussed this in other videos, the more you get to use it, the more efficient it looks like across the entirety of the game. So it definitely, yeah, there is a setup. There is a setup cost that comes in with that. That one's more of a long term gain,
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. No, I'm just giving you a hard time.
No, no, that's a good point. Like I say, all the principles at the start will come into play here. So if something takes longer to pay off to get these kind of damage values, you actually want more. If I'm not getting damage for several turns, I don't want 2 damage for one resource. I want 3. I want 4 damage for that
Yeah.
resource. It will vary depending on how long it takes. But yeah, these are very raw basic values and more immediate, I would say. If it's going to take you several turns to get this kind of thing, you know, you can expect anywhere between 20% and 50% more, maybe even more. It really varies so much. Some stuff that takes a while to pay off is also conditional. So, there's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Um,
Cool. Any more on damage before we start talking about the threat?
yeah, I think a big point about damage, I just try like the basic numbers in a very general sense. A lot of damage is locked to where it can go. And I think that's kind of, I don't know if you call that conditional,
Yeah.
but I think that's really worth talking about. So the primary forms of damage you have are, I guess we'll call it free damage, damage that you can put anywhere you want, damage for the villain, and damage that is locked to minions. Um, yeah, I think that hits all of them. So damage that can go anywhere is obviously worth more than damage that is locked to a specific type of enemy. I would then prioritize damage to a minion as being more valuable than damage to a villain. So there are exceptions. There are exceptions to the rule. Like if you only damage minions, you're not going to win the game because the villain's not taking any damage at all. So if I could only have damage to minions or only have damage to the villain, I would take the villain. But what this really comes down to is how much you value controlling the board. Um,
Mm.
I'd say some players are a rush play. I'm sure if Brant, from Step Into the Portal, I think was here, uh, he would be arguing for rush. He'd be villain damage all the way, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think me, I'm more control, and a lot of players somewhere in the middle, and players way more control than me, and I will sometimes play a rush deck. It's just a general style I like. But a way I see that minion damage is generally more valuable than villain damage is because a minion's going to immediately attack you, and if you don't deal with it, it's going to keep attacking you. So you're kind of putting out this like fire that the villain has set, and it's going to keep burning away at you. Whereas I actually see damage as a villain being a long-term gain as opposed to short-term. So taking out the minions is short-term, which the immediate value, and hitting the villain is the long-term because
Yeah.
until that villain is like defeated, all that damage is just like investment in actually I hope I win before I'm defeated. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting way to look at it, and I've never really thought about it that way. And then I guess like that leads into the cards kind of, at least the examples that come to the top of my head, the cards that are targeted towards minions do tend to run a little bit higher than the curve, like Relentless Assault. No, you would want 6 out of that, but it does have overkill.
Relentless is interesting because overkill is kind of like blurs the line between is it the minion or is it villain?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say what something that's interesting for damage is that aggression cards actually tend to be a little bit inefficient compared to signature or even like some other aspect cards. It does vary.
Yeah.
There's a lot of variance, but yeah. But like I said, Relentless would hit the at least the 1.5, so I consider it decent. I would like I consider Relentless Assault is still a good card to this day, in all honesty. So the overkill makes it kind of has that nice flexibility to it.
Right.
Um,
Because there are a lot more now, but I mean, a lot of minions sit at lower than 5 health. And so if you're
yes.
dealing 5 health or 5 damage to a minion, a lot of times you're losing efficiency unless you have that overkill. So,
Yes.
cool.
Yep. Yeah. And again, Relentless Assault as a specific example has that kicker requirement where if you want to get the overkill, you've got to pay the physical. So that's a little bit of a downside. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so there's again a lot of moving values. If you're getting 1.5 damage per resource, at least pretty good. 2 is good. Um, I would say, yeah, things that target minions. Trying to think of the examples. Some of them don't vary that heavily. Um,
Out of my
some
way.
of them do. We don't talk about that card here.
Okay.
um, yes.
Nice. Okay. Um yeah, so thwarting. I think a lot of the conversation that we had around damage can apply to threat removal as well, where
Yeah.
I don't know what the number is, but I'm sure you'll tell me here in a second. But the idea behind conditional versus unconditional, big burst versus, split up, all kind of factors into what you are expected to pay and expected to deck build per scenario or per general sense for. And so, just with that caveat, let's talk about thwarting. How much
Yep.
should I pay to remove one threat?
We've done a lot of rewinding in that, and I would say how much you want to pay for your threat removal depends on how much content you own, because damage is really interesting. The developers, designers, I think have said this, that swinging web kick is the blueprint. That is the baseline. That is the,
Mm-hmm.
every other card kind of was damage card. Originally, at least, was balanced from that. So, I pay 1 effective resource, I get 2 damage. That is where that comes from. For thwarting, core set thwarting, it's very different from, let's say, X-Men hero thwarting. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. So if you're watching this and you're kind of new to the game, or only have like some of the earlier products, or only a few, you might think, wow, he wants this much threat removal for this cost, and you shouldn't worry about that. You've got to deal with what you have. But as a general sense, in the modern game, full card pool. Um, Honestly, this is not an exact thing. I would say a lot of people probably roughly agree with what I said about damage. Threat removal, I think, is a lot more hotly debated. But the way I would say it, and this is generally a general look across all the aspects, is that if you could get 1.5 threat removal for 1 resource, you've got a pretty good deal there.
Okay.
So an example of this is, we're talking about effective resources. So a 2-cost card, no, sorry, a 1-cost card that removes 3 threat is really good. You've got the advantage of the versatility because it's cheap, but also you're getting a good amount, a lot of bang for your buck, as you would say. That kind of value exceeds the Justice, which I think was one of the original baseline cards I used for threat removal. Although it's better than a lot of hero core set hero threat removal cards. So it's hard to establish the exact value the design is intended, and but like I say, if I can get 1.5 for 1 resource, I'm like, this is a great deal.
Yeah.
Then there are the cards where you get 2 threat removal for 1 resource, and these days that's actually pretty common. Core set, it's not. I don't think. You'll find it with Chase Them Down in Aggression, but that is heavily conditional unless it's
Yeah.
Ultron. Uh, uh, but for the most part, this is something that only Justice has. It has to
Mm.
clear the area with multitasking. and it will exceed this with Overwatch. That's kind of conditional and longer term investments. So again, it's really good value. Uh, and a lot of modern signature cards will remove that. Uh, I think if you were to include Cyclops getting you a card back from his Tactical Brilliance, it works out. Actually, that one works out more similar to the 1.5 for one resource. We might put some
Right.
examples on screen and post.
Yeah, yeah,
Don't know if
yeah.
we can
There
do
will
that.
be. There will be.
And I think Nova's, if you pay over wild, he gets 2 threat removal for every resource spent. Shadowcat's Airwalk, again, you have to be in phased, but that's pretty easy for her most of the time. She'll get 4 threat removal for 2 effective resources.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, which you won't find that on Hulk. You won't find that quite on 4. He's got quite a downside on his threat removal card. And it will vary heavily with the aspects. But that's generally 1.5 for one resource, good. 2 threat removal for one resource, really good. You can even go below 1.5 threat removal for one resource, and I'm still happy. I still think For Justice is a great card. For Justice, I think I might have said this in other videos, but it's never the best card for the situation, but it's always a good card for the situation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of got a versatility in a sense, because Clear the Area is really good if I can zero off a scheme. Multitasking is really good if there are 2 schemes. For Justice is just good, but it's good no matter what the situation is.
Yeah.
And then we have the Dark Times, 1 threat removal for 1 resource, also known as She-Hulk level 14.
Well, she looks even less with like her
Well,
legal
that's true.
practice.
No, that is even less. You're right. Yeah, I guess we're not quite that bad, but if
But
you're
yeah.
desperate for threat removal, 1 threat removal per effective resource spent, it's still fine. It's okay. If that's what you need, it's okay. 1 threat removal point for point is worth a little bit more than damage, if you hadn't already gathered. So it's not the worst deal in the world to get 1 threat removal for 1 resource. But that's more something I'll do by necessity and not by design. So it might be I've got a 2 attack, 1 for ally, rather attack, but if I need the 1 threat removal,
Right.
maybe I'll make that work. Something along those lines. Or if my signature cards are already bad for threat removal, even the She-Hulk one that is less than 1 resource per card spent, that's what I need. I have played that card before. Not for a while, but I've played that card.
Yeah. It's conditional and below the cost curve. So it's a tough card. It's a tough card, especially if going back to the beginning of the video, if you value cards as more than resources. So now if it's a 1.2 or whatever number that we arbitrarily assign to it, then it's even worse. But
Yep.
I wonder if like threat removal is more valuable in smaller chunks than damage is. Is that a fair statement? Mainly because and I guess I am clouded a little bit by primarily solo play because there's less threat to remove than there is damage to deal. And
Yeah.
I always have I'm counting down in my like win or my game in condition for damage where I'm counting up in threat. And so the game is adding threat and I'm reducing damage. So it is if I have a 3 for 8 for my swinging web kick, I almost always have a outlet for that 3 to 8. That can be the villain. Whereas if I have a crisis averted, which is a 3 for 6 threat removal, and there's only 2 threat on the main. So like I guess is that just me as a solo player that values the lower threat, or is that just overall in even a multiplayer game lower still efficient threat at lower cost, lower chunks is better off, or is that just always fair to say because of versatility?
So there's a bit to unpack here. And you're partially yes, it's solo bias, but partially no. So in general, I would agree that it's more important to have smaller packets of threat removal than damage, in a general sense. And if you only have cards up until wave 4, which is Mad Titan's Shadow, this extends, I think, even into multiplayer. As long as you can have the supply, just do it in smaller chunks, that's fine. What changed in wave 5 with Spider Ham, and this card is also coming in Domino's Precon in the upcoming very imminent next evolution box. It's a little card called Overwatch. And so in multiplayer, now you hit the bigger chunks of threat removal. It's kind of exponential is the wrong word. You kind of double what you're putting in, right? So I think, especially with player side schemes coming into effect,
Oof.
Overwatch is going to become even more of a staple than I would say it already is right now. Um, so you're playing with Overwatch, you're actually probably valuing some bigger chunks nowadays because it's so efficient. Because if you don't know what Overwatch is, maybe you're newer to the game, I should probably explain. I think it's an upgrade. You attach it to a scheme, and when you thwart that scheme, you get to duplicate that threat removal somewhere else. And it's a zero cost card. So I put this zero cost card on one scheme. I take off 6 threat. Now for the zero cost card, I get to duplicate 6 threat removal from another scheme. And if that sounds crazy, that's because it is. um,
Especially because it's not a forced response. It is, you get to choose when to trigger it, so you can leave
yeah.
it out there. It's a zero cost. I mean, like it's just so good. It thins the
Yeah.
deck even if you don't ever use it. It's a great option for caught off guard if you really need it. I mean, like it's just so
Mm.
many. It's a good card.
I can't remember if you actually control Overwatch when it's on an enemy thing, but
I think you do.
maybe.
I think you control every
Maybe.
upgrade you play. I don't know.
Either way, I would say Overwatch is just very good.
Yeah.
Even though you might not use it immediately, so it can be a longer sort of considered a longer term game. It's conditional that you now need to thwart that one. If there's something I see newer players especially do, I think, is they'll put uh, Overwatch on a side scheme when maybe they're not planning to actually they can't get over that turn, and then maybe and a crisis side scheme will then come into play or something, and they're running the classic combos crisis averted and Overwatch. So you really want Overwatch on the main scheme is what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah.
But it is such a good card, and it kind of defies all the values here. Because you will normally get way more than 2 threat removal for your 1 effective resource. Like, it will blow that out of the water. It is conditional. You need 2 schemes. If there's a crisis and you don't have crisis averted, it can be trickier. That's a Shadow Cat. All these different considerations. But yeah, I will say because of the existence of Overwatch, and even more actually because of the imminent arrival of player side schemes, it's not always so clear cut. I will say in solo, small chunks still going to be quite good, but I think even in 2 to 4 player, being able to just double your threat removal onto all these side schemes that we're now going to have around is really good to have. So you might not want Crisis Averted at say 2 player, but you might be now a lot more interested in For Justice, which with Overwatch, so For Justice is a 2 cost, 3 effective resource cost card, removes 4 threat. And in Overwatch, it's now 4 for 8. So now you're getting your 2 for 1 resource value out of it. So
Yeah.
a lot of numbers here. Hopefully this makes sense to people. Small is good, especially in solo, but big is better if you have Overwatch in your collection, and it's going to keep getting better as player side schemes become more and more of a thing.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited for player side schemes.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Me too.
Well, I have a lot of questions that go into kind of like basic activation. I think those probably live a little bit better in our next video. Is there anything else that we wanted to put into this video before we sign off?
To rewind to almost the beginning, no, something I didn't actually mention, but I will just touch on very, 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 very quickly, just so it's covered, is are all resources equal, or is say a wild more valuable than a normal resource?
Okay,
And
yeah.
I would say 90% of the time they're the same. It is situational based on what's on the board or what your deck is built. If you have cards that require specific resources,
Yeah.
just thought that was worth a quick mention. Maybe obvious. We've probably been over it before in the series. But I think, if I can have the option between a wild resource and a non-wild resource, I would take the wild. They are surprisingly useful with a lot of villain attachments, especially.
Yeah.
But not a big difference there. I think I like what we covered about threat removal. Honestly, I think I'm happy with the values we gave. 1.5 threat removal for one resource is good. A little bit under, still good. 2 for 1, very good. Overwatch, broken. I will say in multiplayer, the threat removal scales higher and higher because side schemes scale up. So I do think Overwatch is a pretty healthy card to have.
Yeah.
Damage, 2 for 1 resource, great to aim for. I think I'm good with what we covered.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on and talking about it. Um, I always learn so much just talking. So I hope that the viewers also get as much as I do out of these videos. But I appreciate you and all the knowledge that you have for the game. Before we sign off, tell everyone where they can find you one more time.
You can find me mostly on Marvel CDB. It is a website with a lot of decks on it, and I make a lot of them. And that's mainly it. Sometimes Reddit. Here and now I'm Discord. Um, can we plug the Discord? I don't feel like we don't normally
Oh
plug the
yeah,
Discord.
yeah. Let's plug the Discord. There's a living card game Discord where we all hang out and have a good time. We do everything from just general discussions to monthly challenges to deck factories, which Villain runs. And so the deck factory is, Villain comes up with a card that maybe doesn't get as much love as some of the other cards, and people build decks around that card. So we get to see variety in there. But it's a good place. I love our Discord. So
Yeah, that's great there.
awesome. Well, thank you all for watching out. Stay tuned for the next one where we're going to talk about some healing, defending, and some niche cards. So, see you next time.